Can you tell me a bit more about your current project that you're working on?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a mouthful. The project's called What Are We Actually Doing in Asana? And it arises out of the fact that in Toronto, where I'm from, Canada, I was a yoga community organizer, and that put me in touch with many, many teachers, probably the majority of yoga teachers in the city, all of the studio owners. I spent 6 years as an Ayurvedic therapist in downtown Toronto, mainly serving the yoga community, and also over a decade of practice, speaking to students and colleagues. It became clear to me that, almost nobody gets out of yoga without an injury. Now, that's not a big deal in one regard. People are injuring themselves doing all kinds of things. But what's distinct and perhaps concerning about yoga injuries is that people are usually drawn to yoga for implied therapeutic benefits. And people, they'll sign studio waivers acknowledging that they might get injured in class and that their teachers are not, medical authorities or anything like that. But there's this overall principle within the marketing that this is good for you. And after, as I said, about a decade of hearing stories of difficulty, and some stories were about people pushing themselves too far. Some stories were about people coming into practice with prior conditioning issues that gave them some disadvantage. But then there were other stories of people being aggressively or invasively adjusted by teachers, and those were actually most troubling. So there's a whole range of injuries that I had heard about. And as I slowly drew down my professional teaching career, because I started to write and to travel more, I had the time and the distance away from the industry enough to be able to look at it without any kind of, or with a declining professional stake, which allowed me to be a little bit more honest about what I'd heard. And when I decided to formally research, I suppose, the shadow side of this wonderful art form, I put out a call on social media, and I got hundreds upon hundreds of responses, people wanting to tell me stories about how they had injured themselves, how they'd been injured, incompetent teaching, poor biomechanics advice, being adjusted in ways that weren't appropriate or that were too forceful. And so I immediately found myself up to my neck in, I think, a lot of untold stories so far. And it's been about 1.5 years that I've been working on it. I've done almost, I would say, about 150 interviews. And it's not just interviews of practitioners and teachers, but also interviews of yoga scholars, biomechanics researchers, exercise scientists, people who work in the neuroscience of movement, to try to figure out what exactly is happening when people come to the mat. What are they doing in their movement practices? What kind of psychology do they bring to practice? What are the social pressures in the room that contribute to the experience in one way or another? So it's a very wide-ranging study, and I'm intensely grateful to my very patient interview subjects who have shared so much with me. And not only have they shared, this is what I love about the project, not only have they shared stories of trial and tribulation, but every shadow is instrumental to some form of learning that they usually describe for me. One of the first interviews that I did was with Victor Van Kooten, and I think I'm going to begin the book with this interview. He was with Mr. Iyengar for 15 years. Studied with him in Pune for much of that time, went back and forth between India and Europe. And at a certain point in their relationship, he describes there being some interpersonal tension, a little bit of distance emerging in this teacher-student relationship, which is very strong. And in that context, one day, Mr. Iyengar adjusts Victor over a 4x4 inch post, and as he does so, he injures Victor's back. Now, it's not diagnosed, there's no X-ray or MRI from the time, but Victor is so injured that he's immobilized for many, many days, cannot move. And this sort of is the beginning part of the disintegration of the relationship, unfortunately. But it's also the starting point for Victor reimagining how asana is for him or should be for him. So as he's lying paralyzed in his bed in Pune, he's a visual artist and by trade, and he says to himself, well, how will I move my legs again? And he begins a process of visualizing space around his legs, and he finds that if he can visualize this space strongly enough, distinctly enough, that somehow it motivates the musculature, the bones, the leg itself to flow into this new space. So instead of doing what he had done for the past 15 years, which was to obey the alignment instructions of this very certain, very stern teacher, he then began to imagine the new space that his body could flow into. And it's on the basis of that that his entire teaching practice began to emerge, his unique teaching practice began to emerge. So every story is like that. Every story of overwork yields to a kind of story of acceptance. Every story of interpersonal strife yields, if not to forgiveness, to a deeper sense of interpersonal wisdom. And so I've been really grateful for that. I think that the title of the project, What Are We Actually Doing in Asana, ironically is impossible to answer, as the research is showing me. But the stories that I get to hear as I ask the question are so rich that I hope they will be of benefit to people who are navigating some unconscious stuff when they come to the mat, unconscious motivations, especially.